Welcome to Everlutionary, a podcast about how we can restore balance and heal the world. Every episode of my show, we explore the future of humanity and how we've gotten to where we are today. Through inspirational stories about healing, science, and mysticism, we'll see how we can reshape our society to create a world free of violence. I'm your host, Hawah Kasat. One story at a time. That's a guiding principle that you'll encounter when diving into the world of Noor Tagouri, a trailblazer whose career has carved out spaces for underrepresented stories. Noor is an award-winning journalist and producer who has told stories in every medium, from radio and print to documentaries and national brand campaigns. Noor's work not only informs but transforms. Her award-winning series, Sold in America, explores the complex narrative of selling sex in the United States. This series won a Gracie Award for its insightful investigation. But Noor didn't stop there. She founded At Your Service Media with a mission to tell transformative stories that aren't just heard, but felt. Through her Webby-nominated series, Rep, a story about the stories we tell, Noor challenges us to reconsider the narratives we consume daily and compels us to think critically about representation and objectivity in the media we trust. As we prepare to delve into a conversation about storytelling, journalism, death, and the quest for truth, I invite you to reflect on her approach to breaking barriers, healing, and building bridges through media, and how our own stories are intertwined with those we listen to, shaping our understanding of ourselves and each other in profound ways. Thanks for joining today for another episode of Everlutionary. Let's go. Here we are. Hey, Noor, how are you? Welcome to my podcast. Thanks for saying yes.
Kidding. It was a no-brainer. So happy to be here.
Now, just so you know, I'm super intimidated because I'm not a journalist and I am one of those human beings that's out here trying to curate incredible conversations. Even though I've made a couple of documentary films, I have no resume like you do in this field. So please take this space I'm holding with you with that grain of salt.
You don't got to be a professional question asker to ask great questions.
I like that. That's great. And I appreciate that. I am so inspired. I met you a couple of months ago now. We met during a sound alchemy and healing retreat with yoga and asana and meditation and singing songs out in Massachusetts at a retreat center. And now we're here on the podcast, and you've done so many incredible things with your life. I didn't even know where to start or how to begin. But for our listeners around the world, I always feel like it's important to place us geographically. So I'm right now in Northern California. I'm an hour and a half from San Francisco. I moved here from Washington, D.C. about a year ago. Tell us, where are you right now? I hear crickets in the background. What's going on?
I am in the Hudson Valley, so upstate New York on a mountain, but also by way of the DMV, which is part of why we bonded so much.
The DMV, the DC, Maryland, and Virginia. And you were born in Virginia, correct?
I was born in West Virginia, but I only lived there for 8 days. And then we moved to Alabama for a couple of years. Then we moved to Southern Maryland.
Okay, all on the East Coast of the United States. And now you're in the Hudson Valley. Beautiful, beautiful Hudson Valley. What are you, a couple hours from New York City?
Just a couple hours. It's a perfect back and forth situation that I love spending as much time as possible up here.
Yeah, I'm so glad you're out there. I love all the sounds of the nature. What's alive for you right now? What's been moving through you? What's been coming up for you?
I just finished a massive writing session. I've been working on writing a book, and specifically in the book proposal process. And I have really been feeling stuck about what is the question that I'm really asking with the story that I'm telling right now. And I just had this really big breakthrough that just kind of started with this question of how the heck did I get here? I was born to Libyan immigrants in West Virginia. I grew up in Southern Maryland. I swore I would never cover my hair. But the other thing that I knew for sure was that I wanted to be on television and to be the quote unquote next Oprah. And then 15 years later, after a really successful chapter of my life, being a public Muslim American figure who broke so many barriers, being a hijab wearing woman and doing the things that I was doing, to sitting at the top of a mountain, rarely in clothing up here, painting, dancing, crying, and hugging trees and doing other hippie shit. Like, how did I get here? And how do I make meaning of that journey? And how do I actually self investigate that journey to better understand what stories are not only still alive in me, but that really are demanding to be revisited?
Wow. Demanding to be revisited and also needing to be shared with the world is what kind of comes up for me. So I've recently been imbibing your multitude of podcasts, which are all amazing, by the way. And I was learning so much about your family and just how rich your cultural perspective is. I know you were born here in the States, but from what I'm understanding and gathering, you did travel overseas at least a handful of times when you were young, right? Did you travel to Libya?
Yeah, we went to Libya. I specifically went twice for like 3 months at a time. And I've been really, really eager to go back. It's just a very complicated situation for me to do that.
And how old were you when you went back to Libya?
I went when I was 10, 11, and then again when I was 14. Both pivotal childhood moments.
Yeah, 10, 11, you're talking about like fifth grade probably. And then 14, you're also like in high school at that point, right?
Yeah, because when I came back, I was starting high school, and it's so wild because I remember I came back with tons of blonde highlights and then these like blue green colored contacts. And I had gotten my hair done in Libya, and the contacts, which was, I'd never seen anything like that in America. And I used to think it was so cool. And I'm just like, wow, it was so sad because even there, we're trying to look like people here.
I can really relate. And I think we bonded over multiple things when we first met. We bonded over poetry because we're both poets and we love poetry. We bonded over being from the DMV area, the DC, Maryland, Virginia area. And then we also bonded over being the children of immigrants. So similar to you, when I was young, I went to India for about 2.5 months at a time. And often those trips were to Mumbai, Bombay, and I'd be there during the summer break. So between third and fourth grade, I'd be living in Mumbai for 3 months, and then I'd come back and I'd do all my public schooling here in the States. And those experiences for me were probably some of the most transformational, important moments in my life. And I'd love to hear from you a little bit about how your world perspective changed through those trips you took when you were a child, when you were really young and you were there. What did you see that gave you some different perspective or insight on the world?
Well, it's so interesting, and I'm sure you'll relate to this because that experience was always like so separate from my life at home in Southern Maryland. Like, I grew up in a very rural, conservative, majority white town where many of my friends had never even been on an airplane before or had a passport. And even if we weren't going to Libya, I was privileged enough that we traveled every summer. And my grandparents lived an hour away in Virginia, which was a lot like more diverse. So I had these kind of two lives, like one with my like friends at school, but then also whenever I was with my family and whenever I would travel, I was with my family. And I think looking back on it, it's like it's what plants the seeds of not everyone lives the way that we live. And this isn't the only life experience. And I just found myself always collecting stories and asking family members questions. But there's also another layer to this, which is that most of my family in Libya doesn't speak English. So I'm having a really hard time fully connecting or fully communicating unless some of them, the cousins or the younger cousins who would know English because they would watch American television. But then there's this other layer of when you would try to speak Arabic, I would get like made fun of by my cousins. So then I would feel so embarrassed that I wouldn't even bother. And there's so many reasons that children have these experiences of shame and embarrassment, of trying to speak another language, of not fully being able to connect with their relatives. It's really heartbreaking in a way. And so a lot of the experiences that I had in the stories that I kind of collected, if I were to revisit all of them now, they're very different because I have the understanding of why I was the way that I was back then. So I'm very much in a reflective mindset right now. So it's hard to go into specifics about my experience there, except for I really got to like meet all of these strangers who happened to share blood with me.
Yeah. I can also really relate. Similarly, had the challenge of speaking like broken Hindi. And so also with my cousins, always kind of just one off, heavy accent, couldn't like fully put all the sentences together. Kind of felt a little not like I fully fit in India and not like I fully fit in here in the US either, even though I was born and raised here. It was a consistent barrage of xenophobia and racism. And I feel like in your podcast, Rep, you did a lot about unpacking the three Ps of politics, pop culture, and public opinion. And you spoke a lot about being an Arab American in the US. That's an incredible story. Could you tell us a little bit about that project and about how you've been able to continue to share your perspective on what it's like to have to be telling your story?
Yeah, thank you. I really feel it is in order for us to investigate any hard, big societal structure, concept, or institution, a good starting point is to ask, what is the role that I play in it, in this problem? And sometimes it might feel like, what do you mean? The system is so broken. How can there be room for you? How can you ever be to blame? But it's not really a blame approach. It's more of a like, where do you show up in this dynamic and in this story? The three Ps is like a really good tool to use in order to hyper focus on a part of that dynamic. So if you're looking at pop culture, politics, and public opinion, you can often find a thread from one experience and how it's influenced the others. So the example that I use by starting with my own family story in Rep is that in 1985, Back to the Future was the blockbuster hit, summer 1985. And the opening scene is Doc and Marty running from Libyan terrorists who are like barbaric and they're speaking some gibberish language. And then less than a year later, in the spring of 1986, Ronald Reagan, the president at the time, bombs Tripoli, Libya, in an attempt to assassinate the then dictator Muammar Gaddafi. But instead of killing him, they end up bombing an apartment complex where five of my family members happened to be sleeping. That was their home. And my great uncle, his son's little league game in Oklahoma, while this happened, was watching the news on a 2-inch black and white television screen that he carried with him everywhere because he was such a news junkie. And when the Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, announced the bombing and the location of the bombing, my great uncle ran home, called his family in Libya. They were sleeping. So in the middle of the night, woke them up. They were awoken by glass shattering from the windows because of the explosion down the street where the rest of the family lived. And he tells his sister to tell her husband to go down the street and check on the family because he feared they may have vanished. And they had. And this experience, revisiting the story, was really profound. It was the first time I had interviewed my family members in such a candid and purposeful way, where I was interviewing them for the story. And they had never talked about this situation and this extremely traumatic event in this context. And so I love that story gives us the space to do that and the opportunity to do that. But 1 week after I tell this story, or I air this episode of the story, which has at this point fully consumed me. I mean, I'm having literal dreams of the night of the bombing where I'm feeling, hearing, smelling everything. In my meditation, I'm seeing my family who was killed in an apartment being rebuilt, and my great uncle has all of this incredible archival tape because he recorded all of the broadcasts around that covered the bombing. And I stumble upon this footage of like a Phil Donahue episode where hundreds of Americans are gathered town hall style. They don't even know any civilians have died in this bombing because it was never reported. However, they're all debating and arguing about why the US would bomb another country. And I'm just so emotional because this country bombs other countries every single day. And no one's out here so passionately discussing this on mainstream television. So it was really a wild thing. And I incorporated that into the episode as well, this being the public opinion piece. And a week after the episode airs, I'm speaking at Harvard University about the misrepresentation of Arabs in media. And I shared this story, and a woman stands up in the crowd during the Q&A, shaking. She's an older woman, white hair with a pen and paper, notepad. And she looks at me and she says, "This question's for Noor. Are you talking about the 1986 bombing of Tripoli, Libya?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And she barely can get it out and just says, "I stood in that apartment the day after the bombing." And she was a 29-year-old American journalist, which is the same age I was on that stage. And she was in Libya assigned. She worked for the Wall Street Journal, and she stood in the house that was flattened, the apartment building, the day after. And later we find out she actually lives very close to my family in the DMV area. And she pulled out the archives of her newspaper clippings from the 80s where she reported on the casualties. And it was the first time my family ever saw the number of people who had died, which is about 100 people in that apartment building in that area. And she brought pieces together of that story to us, and we were able to put together pieces through hers. And so the series that started out as like just investigating media and misrepresentation and the role that I play, and viscerally became this experience of what it means for a story to be alive and what it means to revisit a story when it demands to be acquainted with again, and what it means to understand that there is no such thing as collateral damage, that people are not numbers, that people are always human beings with families and lineages that are going to carry this trauma, and what the concept of truth and objectivity actually mean. So all of these questions and so many more that I continued pulling on in this rep investigation. And it really was the story that turned me inside out. I just wrote, like, I often found myself walking around feeling my insides were literally living on my outsides because I felt so sensitive and aware. And the way that I saw the world was changing so quickly right before my eyes that this work could have only been done had I been living on this mountain in this space and really being able to be in nature and allow this earth to like hold me through the process.
Noor, you mentioned that there was a level of objectivity that you felt was needed to tell these stories, but at the same time, as a journalist, but also as somebody that has lived these experiences in your own body through your own lived experiences here in the United States, you probably also have to sometimes thread a needle with figuring out how to tell these stories in a way where you're keeping yourself semi a part of it, but also semi removed. How do you navigate that really tricky space of being a journalist that's also endured so much? So you've had family members that have been lost through the bombings, and how do you keep that balance?
Great question. And it's a question that I constantly revisit. I actually just revisited today an article that I wrote over 10 years ago called Blurred Lines Between Activism and Journalism. And it was an article that I wrote because I had seen somebody subtweet me about posts that I had made about Israel and Gaza and Palestine back like 10 years ago. And it was like somebody that I had worked with or whatever subtweeting me saying that journalists should only report on the facts and stick to the facts and whatever. I knew he was talking about me because I was posting it, even though I, at the time, was like so adamant that I was reporting incredibly objectively. But I reflect in this piece that feels even more relevant today, something that Christiane Amanpour spoke about, where actually I write, we must report fairly on both sides of a story, but never draw a false moral equivalence. And we must call out aggressors and victims in order to carry out our journalistic duty of telling stories so compelling. People have no choice but to put aside race, status, politics, and religion and serve humanity as citizens of the world. And I literally wrote that over 10 years ago. And it's a whole piece, but I used to get called an activist all the time. People would not recognize me as a journalist. And all I ever wanted was to be recognized as a journalist, because as a journalist, being called an activist is like the worst thing that you can be called, because it means you're not doing your job right. And at least that's how I learned it. That's how I was trained as a journalist. And I felt like I was only being called a journalist because my hair was covered. And so people thought I was making a political statement, even though it had nothing to do with the stories I was telling. And I shared this with a friend of mine last month over dinner. And she goes, "But Noor, you have always been an activist." And I was so offended. I was like, "Why would you say that? I'm literally telling you, like, I wasn't. I'm a journalist." And she was like, "You don't just tell random stories. You tell stories where you want change to happen. And is advocacy, that's activism." And I was like, wait. And I started thinking about all the stories I've covered and how every single story that I've covered, because thankfully I've always gotten to choose the stories that I report on for the most part. I cover it because like there's something that needs to change. And granted, I still will never call myself an activist. I also just try not to call myself anything anymore, because titles and labels are just like not my thing. But what comes alive when you ask me that question of how I've balanced it is that I have actively engaged in investigating who I am and my identity since the beginning of my journalism career, because I always had to work a lot harder to prove that I was an objective journalist. So in order to understand objectivity, I had to understand my worldview and my biases and how that might creep into a story that I'm reporting on. And in that practice, I became a great journalist. And I now realize that this is the key ingredient that needs to be taught in journalism school and in our practices, which is that in order to be a really good storyteller, reporter, question asker, investigator, you need to be so intimately familiar with why you are who you are. And once you understand that, you can look at a story and be like, where is any of my projection bleeding into this? Where can I use my experience to ask specific, intentional, powerful questions? And how, in turn, can this story be of service to whoever we are talking about? And so that's how I do it.
Wow. How do you peel apart? And for some of us that are new to the terminology, you said false moral equivalence. What does that mean to the layperson when you say that?
So a false moral equivalence, this is based on something that Christiane Amanpour said. And so I'm going to read what she said specifically because it gives the context. So when she was reporting on the genocide in Bosnia, she was met with such backlash because she was being told that she wasn't being objective in her reporting and that she was favoring the people who were being genocided. And so she writes, "I was forced to examine what objectivity actually means. And I realized that in a situation such as the one in Bosnia, where you had ethnic cleansing and genocide, you have a duty to call it like it is and to tell the truth. Objectivity in that regard means giving all sides a fair hearing, but never drawing a false moral equivalence. So I called who were the aggressors and who were the victims. And I'm very, very proud of that now, because that was what we had to do. And I think that that was the right thing as journalists. And eventually this managed to be part of the reason the world intervened."
Wow. So it's specifically naming that there are a specific group of people that are marginalized or oppressed, and another group of people that are in power and privilege that are either abusing or somehow not in a humane way utilizing their power and privilege. And so without acknowledging that dichotomy and that power struggle, then we're actually not doing our work and our job as storytellers, as journalists, because then we're also not being objective because that's the story as it is unfolding in front of us.
Exactly. And so even and then you're like forcing it. Even then you're forcing the story into the confinements of the status quo. And the status quo, without like trying to go into any jargon, is patriarchal and white supremacist. And that's like what the fallacy of objectivity is, right? It's that it's impossible to actually be objective because the standard that has been set is from a very specific point of view. And when you look back at coverage, especially when it comes to coverage around war, and you can see this now with what's happening in Palestine, you're watching journalism and storytelling be weaponized and used to propagate and to justify terrible, terrible things. And that's what happened post 9/11 with the Iraq invasion, with Afghanistan, and we're seeing it until today.
That's right. And knowing that it seems impossible to be fully objective, no matter what we're doing. We're humans that are still in our personal stories and narratives. We have our own personal life experiences that have brought us to these moments. Would you agree with that? That it's probably pretty impossible for any of us to be fully objective while telling a story?
Well, it's let's like take apart the word objective. And it simply couldn't be possible because every person's universe and world is an entirely different one because you have your own set of experiences. The way that you see everyone is going to be different. And so if you wanted to be as close to objective as possible, then that requires you being as transparent as possible. And that means like transparency in where you're coming from and the questions that you're asking and the pieces in the story that might be missing and the things that you may not have considered. Transparency and sharing my work and the process is so critical in my approach to journalism because I also recognize that I'm going to cover this story completely different than you might cover this story. And also because I do believe that if you're not advocating for change, for the betterment of all humanity in the stories that you're telling them, why are you doing this? And that is totally a personal preference. That is just my approach to journalism. And I feel like I can say it with my chest now because I recognize that that's actually what I've always been doing. But to me, I'm just like, yeah, because I wouldn't want to do it any other way.
I love that. And thank you for boldly and audaciously telling your story and sharing your story with others, especially through the Rep podcast, which is incredible. As we look forward, do you have more aspirations for how you continue to tell these stories with the world and share your vision?
So we have a storytelling company called At Your Service. And one of my philosophies is to focus on the story first, medium second, meaning that the story is the most important part of the equation. I want to make a TV show. I want to make a movie. I want to make a podcast. I want to make a whatever. How does the story want to be expressed? So part of like the journey that I'm in right now is I have a couple of stories that I'm working with and I'm engaging in how those want to be expressed. So one is a book, one is a live tour in film. And the reason and the intention behind those things is because what's more important to me now than ever before in telling these stories is also gathering community and showing them how to engage in their own storytelling and in their own self-investigation because I really believe that when we have active question askers and storytellers who are curious and thoughtful and intentional and are able to move through their fear, we can do really big healing work. And I'm really interested in that right now because of the just level of excruciating pain that we're all experiencing.
I've noticed in my own life, as I'm starting to get a little older, that I'm starting to lose people in my life a little bit more. Like I've lost people that I've played music with to cancer. I have friends that are no longer here on the earth with me. I've got relatives that have been passing away, the stories that we have around that. And I've noticed you've recently been lifting up this new opportunity for people to get involved in what you're calling the Death Club, an opportunity for people to come together to talk about death and transition. And you just said there's a lot of grieving and pain in the world, and that's true. And there's also a lot of transitioning. And there's a lot of fear that we have as humans, I think, from leaving this mortal existence, this planetary existence. It's probably one of the greatest fears we have is passing from our body and the fear of the unknown of what's next and what's after our last breath. Can you explain what was the inspiration for this one? Because I loved it when I saw that you had this, and I was like, yes, this is kind of the conversation that we need to be having as a society around what is death?
Well, thank you for saying that. Also, you should totally come through if you want to join, let me know. So, something I've been thinking about, and first, these community groups are an offering that we do with At Your Service monthly. So we meet on Sundays for 2 hours. We just did poetry club. We've done book clubs. We've done rep clubs, which is actually going through my investigation rep, but each person is documenting their own story in that format. For Death Club, it started out as a joke in one of the book clubs where there was the ending chapters were about death, and a lot of people didn't read it because they were really too afraid to, or they were still processing a grief, whether it was recent or even like 25 years old, that they still couldn't read the chapter about death. And when I first did a rep club, I intuitively just opened the entire session before even introducing myself with blurting out, raise your hand if you know for sure what happens after we die. And I come from religious background. I grew up Muslim, and there are people obviously in the group who also are. And so it's like I saw everyone's face just drop and they're like, what the hell is this? And I basically said the fact that none of us know for certain, we've seen with our own two eyes, we have actual evidence of exactly what happens afterwards, tells me that whoever created us or put us on this planet clearly wanted us to ask really big questions, because they didn't give us the answer to the ultimate question of what happens after we die. And I really believe that so much of what the world goes through on a cyclical basis is rooted in people's fear of trying to control being alive as long as possible, and fear of not entirely knowing what's going to happen after we die, or fear because they have a very specific belief of what happens after we die, or fear because it's just freaking scary. It's a terrifying thing. And I think I've been exploring this idea that we actually go through several deaths in one lifetime because different versions of ourselves die all the time. I feel like this recent chapter of me like transitioning from covering my hair to not covering my hair is a death. And it felt that way. And I had to do a lot of processing grief and whatever. So like somebody who commented on that video said, I like to hit things straight on, head on. And if this is something that's like on my mind, then I want to gather in community around it. I want to bring together experts who can help us move through these fears, learn how to embody practices so that we can prepare for death, to be able to find joy and maybe even pleasure in the idea that we're going to pass, to write our potential wills, to just like dance with death in a way. When it knocks on our door, it arrives as a friend. And that's my intention.
Hey, there's so much there to unpack. I mean, first, I'm thinking about how you were saying the cycles of what we're experiencing in the world, if even violence in some ways is connected to our fear of death. And easily we can deduce that our quest for survival has us fighting over resources. We live in scarcity. This idea of we need to do whatever we can to survive. Survival is the number one thing that is kind of the default programming of the human instinct, the human mind. And sometimes that means we compromise our values, we compromise what's important to us, we compromise what we love, because we're all trying to do all we can to avoid death and to avoid an early death, and to also have a life in this moment right now that is one of ease, and for some people more than ease, but of luxury. So I think death in some ways becomes a cultivation ground, a practice ground for us to consider, what do we hold on to so tightly? What are we grasping for? In our tradition, the yoga traditions that I've studied in and learned in, we use what's normally called corpse pose or shavasana. We use this as a time to train the body and the mind for the transition of our last breaths. And it's something I've been doing for decades now in terms of my practice. It's preparing this final resting pose. It's known as Shavasana, and preparing by using Shavasana as an opportunity to imagine, what if these were my last 5 minutes alive on the planet? What would I do if these were my last 5 minutes? What would I be thinking? What would be coming through me? What would I be wishing that I had done differently? For example, what would I be wishing that I had reconciled? Who are the people in my life that I love the most that I wish I said I love you to more often? Who are those people? And use that practice every day. Practice dying every day. Die every day in your own heart, in your own mind, so that you can be reborn again 10 minutes later and go and reconcile and pull together that which is unthreaded and unraveled and ravel it and sort of dance with the beauty of the transition.
I'm never going to think of Shavasana the same again. This is why everybody needs to practice yoga with you, Hawah.
But I love that you're calling that in, because there's like ancient wisdom to this that's thousands of years old, where it's not just the art of living. These spiritual practices is not just the art of living, it's the art of dying. It's practicing the art of dying. And I love that you write your own will. I think that's a really cool exercise to think about. Have you done that already? Have you written your own will in that way as a practice?
So for that workshop, I want it to be less like a literal will that you will submit, like that goes piece by piece materially, and more of what is it that you want to leave behind to certain loved ones, what traits, what memories, what stories, what gifts, and whatever it is. But like, I want it to be an actual taking account of the things that you're going to leave. And I haven't done that. That's why I started Deaf Club, so that I could do it, because I have to make an event out of anything like that I want to do. I don't want to do it by myself. I want to do it with a bunch of other people.
Wow. Well, I love it. Sign me up. I think it's a great way to combat the taboo that we have around having conversations around death and dying and grieving. To be frank, we all know that the world is filled with a lot of pain and a lot of people that are transitioning. So thinking of it as a reminder too, that just how precious life is too, and how fragile life can be. And speaking about life, you have another post that really kind of perked my ears. Recently, you were asking the question about whether to have or to not have kids. I love this question, love this idea, and love this meditation. What was coming up for you, and why are you asking this question to all of us? Should we or should we not have kids?
So I do a little series on social just called Questions I'm Asking Myself, because I ask myself these questions all the time. When it comes to have kids or to not have kids, I have a conversation about that every single day. I literally talk to my friends who are parents, who are not parents, who want to be parents, who are struggling to become parents. This is an ongoing conversation because I have multiple things that I think about. One is I feel like children are our greatest teachers, and I love learning. So I would love to experience that level of learning and just that level of a human experience. And then there's also the fear and control of, I want to bring another being into this world. But then there's this responsibility that peeks in, and it's just, yeah, but if you were to bring in another being, it could be a warrior of light for humanity. And maybe we need more of that. So it's just this dance that I go through in my mind constantly. And I don't have a sudden urge or anything like that. I just have an actual sincere fascination with the idea of actually giving birth and the capability of our bodies, and also what it means to bring children into this world and what kind of love and heartbreak you're signing up for. So I'm kind of a human experience junkie at this point. So I'm just have to ask about it.
What kind of feedback have you been getting? What kind of different takes have you gotten on this idea? What are people thinking? Should they have kids? Should they not have kids?
One thing I will say about our audience/community, they are so honest and open. And that's honestly why I ask those questions, because I know I'm going to get real answers. And it was a whole wide array spectrum of things to consider that I had never considered before. But the two things that I will share that stand out to me the most was one person who I know who has three kids who are in their 20s wrote, "You don't know what you don't know. And so having kids is really hard. And if you don't ever have them, then you'll never know what you're missing. So you don't have to really feel badly about it. But then recently, another friend had a child and wrote this whole thing about his experience and how his wife was crying while holding their baby and breastfeeding it. And he was like a really big sob. And he was like, "What's wrong?" And she said, "I'm grieving the past versions of ourselves who almost didn't do this, who almost were like, yeah, no, this isn't for me." And everything that they've ever done or built together was leading them to this experience. And that shifted so much in me because I was like, oh, I can totally also feel and see that experience. And I just emceed like my best friend's wedding in Montana. And I met really cool people while we were there. And somebody came up to me after my speech and who has never met me before and just came up to Adam and I and was, "You guys need to have a kid. We need you guys to have a kid." And I was like, whoa. And I've had some people say that to me before, which is so interesting. And I understand what they mean, but I don't internalize it as pressure either. I'm just, if it happens, it happens. But I do think children are great teachers. Luckily, I'm also like the oldest kid, and my youngest sibling is 13. So I'm still around children, and it's great.
Yeah, you're around children, but you don't have to take them home with you. You do have any nieces or nephews yet?
I have a nephew who is turning 2 in October, and that has been such a transformative experience for our family.
Yeah, I'm the godfather to a couple of my best friend's kids, and one of them would say to me, "Yeah, you love playing with them, but you're not taking them home."
What's your take? Because you're also a teacher.
Yes.
So you spent years around teens.
I spent 15 years working with kids, basically all day, all night. I'd had kids that I was mentoring call me at 11 at night, 1 in the morning, asking for help with things that were happening in their lives in DC. In many ways, it kind of filled my cup of probably whatever desire I had to have my own children at that time, because I was constantly working with kids all day. And as I said, I don't think everything is for everyone. I always think that we all have to kind of think about what we want in our lives and what's important to us. I know there's reasons for both to be beautiful. I think they're both beautiful. And it's really about what kind of life do you want to live? What kind of life do you want to have? I love your perspective of if it happens, it happens. I think it's kind of like the death conversation. That's not like if it happens, it happens. Death is going to happen. Sorry, people, we're all going to die. And this is kind of different because if it happens, it happens. Some of it's perhaps in our control, some of it's not.
Yeah, we were having this conversation with a friend yesterday who has a child and also has full-time help, and was just saying, even with that privilege, he was like, if I ever see a single parent, I will like literally do anything for them because it is so hard and we were not meant to raise children alone.
But Noor, that's why I think we're seeing a trend right now of people not wanting to have children. I think people are like, well, why do people not want to have kids as much anymore? Well,
Because there's no village.
exactly. There's no village to help us raise the kids. And so we're asked to climb Mount Everest with a child. We've got no extended family. We don't live next door to our uncles and aunts. We can't just throw the kids into the middle of the yard and let them just run around outside and play with their relatives. It's like you're all by yourself. Many people are single parents. And I think that makes it harder for people to say yes, because we need support. It takes a village.
Yeah. Universal child care. Where you at?
Uh, Absolutely. So you've been falling in love with your own company. This is what I remember also reading on one of your posts. And you said you fell in love recently with your own company. I want you to tell us a little bit more about how you relate to loneliness and solitude. And I'm imagining this is a great transition because if you had children, it's probably a lot harder to experience solitude. You probably can still experience loneliness. I think loneliness and solitude are different things, but I'm wondering about what does that mean to you when you said, I've been falling in love with my own company?
That's so beautiful. What a thing to say. I just didn't even know you could do it. I grew up in like a house of so many kids and people, and when I got married, my partner, who is more of an introvert and recharges in solitude, like when he needed space, I took it very personally. And I was like, why would you need to be apart? And it wasn't until, to be honest, I started working on rep that I spent a lot of the time in the cabin just working and writing and dancing with myself and painting. And then hours and hours would just go by. And I was like, whoa, I didn't know I could do this. I didn't know I could be eager to run back to the cabin. And it was like such a transition to get there. And then we were in Morocco earlier this year, and I took like a 4-day little retreat by myself in this mountain village in Morocco. And it was so romantic, even though it was in solitude. And it was really a powerful experience. And I mean, how do I relate it to loneliness? I mean, I think you can experience loneliness even in the company of people. I can only speak to my personal experience. And I've definitely had moments of experiencing loneliness. I think in the transition of not covering my hair anymore, a lot of, even though I had support around me and I was privileged enough to have people I could just talk to, there was nobody who could fully understand the experience I was going through. And so loneliness did come up. But I think in this new, I call it my wild woman era, where I'm like really grounding into what it means to be in my body and what feels so natural to me. And part of that is really getting to know who I am and getting to know who I am in my own company.
I love that. Having a romance with yourself all alone, somewhere far away. I also, kind of similar to your partner, I recover and regenerate through solitude. I need time alone to fill my battery back up. I get depleted around people when I'm around people a lot. So I appreciate you bringing that up. We've covered a lot of topics. We've moved through the gamut of a lot of ideas here, Noor, but I've got a couple last things I want to just get your take on. One is we're coming up into a really incredible election cycle, and we're at the precipice of having potentially the first woman president of the United States of America. It's a pretty incredible historical opportunity to break down the patriarchy. And in the midst of that, there's still a lot of questions, a lot of struggles. I know there's many people that feel that not enough is being said or being done, for that matter, to end genocide across the world in Gaza and to work towards alleviating the military industrial complex. And I'm curious, where are you landing right now? What are your meditations bringing to you as you kind of think ahead over the next 8 weeks until November and election day? What's coming up for you in this election cycle?
I feel very disillusioned. I think that I have a bitter taste in my mouth. I don't find the excitement that I wish I had, but I also feel a lot freer being very clear in my moral compass and my values. And I never endorse candidates and I don't talk about who I'm voting and all that. But questions that I'm asking myself right now are, what are the pros and cons of representation in this way, where there's a potential to have the first woman and woman of color president? And especially after I did rep, which is an investigation into representation, how representation or diversity, quote unquote, can often be seen as reaching the pinnacle, when in fact, especially for me with this election, who we are as a people is being put on the line. And I feel so angry at the way that our tax dollars are spent. I don't feel confident in our two-party system at all. I think that it doesn't really matter at this point if there's a Republican or a Democrat in office. Like, there are so many Americans that are suffering, and there's so many people abroad that are suffering because of us. And that needs to be reconciled and alleviated. Granted, I also recognize that democracy is being called into question, that the Republican candidate, nominee, and former president has a very specific plan that could uproot any semblance of democracy we have left. But I'm really right now meditating on and really taken aback by the lack of accountability for all candidates of the two main parties. It feels like a social media election. It's a trip for me to like watch unfold. I know it's like a lot of words because I'm being careful and mindful because I'm very much like in process with this, with what's happening with the election. I have a lot of I don't knows and really strong feelings in my body. So I'm just like letting those feelings kind of move through.
Well, thank you for sharing that and being vulnerable with us around it. It's a hard topic to discuss, I know. So I appreciate you even just leaning in a little bit with me on the question. I feel like we all have to figure out where we fit in these stages and steps of change, and some of the questions around the fundamental flaws within the systems, and then how things can micro changes and macro changes, and where are the micro changes and where are the macro changes, and do we hope to get to the top of the mountain overnight, or do we take steps by steps, and how much are we willing to compromise? I think these are all the hard questions that we're all sitting with. So I appreciate you sitting with those questions for me. I think you're brilliant at asking hard questions. So that's why I wanted to ask you what your questions were around it and thoughts were around it. Do you have anything else you'd like to offer us or share? Anything we didn't get to or cover?
I would just like to leave your listeners with a question to meditate on, which is what does it actually mean to you in your body to be free? And what are you doing to engage in that freedom?
That's a good one to leave us with. Noor, do you want to tell folks? We will always have all of your information at the bottom of the show notes. So listeners, you can find links to Noor and all of her incredible work. But also, could you tell us one or two of the projects you're really excited about connecting people to if people are interested in learning more?
You can listen to Rep, a story about the stories we tell on wherever you get your podcasts. We also have a podcast series called Podcast Noor, which is really thoughtful interview series researching really personal topics. And you can check our work out at ays.media. There's all of our clubs are listed on there. You can sign up for the newsletter to get any of our upcoming work and would love to be in community with you.
Awesome. Yeah, your social links are also at the bottom of the show notes. So please, listeners, be sure to go and support and check out the incredible work. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for taking the time to connect and to make this magic happen. Thanks for weaving your brilliance through the world and your incredible storytelling. It's a gift to all of us. And I'm so grateful to have met you. And I'm glad to have you in my life.
Thank you. Likewise.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, Hawah.
Thank you. Bye. Peace. As we conclude our enlightening conversation with Noor Tagouri, I invite you to reflect on the profound insights shared today. Noor has given us a deeper understanding of the power and responsibility of storytelling and how it can shape, challenge, and enrich our perceptions of the world. Storytelling isn't just about recounting events, but about connecting deeply with our shared human experiences. Storytelling is bridging divides and illuminating truths in a world that often seems fragmented. Noor's work invites us to look beyond the surface, to question and to engage with stories in a way that fosters empathy and understanding. I hope today's conversation has not only enlightened, but also inspired you to explore and appreciate the stories that shape our lives and our communities. I drop a new episode every 2 weeks, and you can always know when that happens by hitting the subscribe, follow, and notification buttons on your podcast app. You can also set the episodes to automatically download. This way you can listen anytime from anywhere. If you're inspired, hit the rating button and drop a review, or simply share this podcast with some friends. All these little things help to take the podcast further out into the world by pushing it on the algorithm. We need more community-driven voices in the world that are not owned by corporate interests. This podcast is commercial-free. It's all heart. So if you want to dive deeper with me in the future, I've got virtual and in-person immersive learning opportunities. You can learn about those by clicking the link in the podcast description. Spread love, be love, and build peace. We need you. We need us. Everlutionary, Restoring balance and healing the natural world is brought to you by me, Hawah Kasat. If you would like to find out more about me and my story, head to hawah.us. That's HAWAH.US. And then make sure to search for me in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Thank you for listening. Stay in touch. Peace.